Three black SUVs pull up to a picturesque beachfront home in coastal Maine. Men in dark suits approach the door. Inside, Catherine Wilson, 65, looks up in confusion as the doorbell rings. Her husband of 40 years, Robert, stands perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When Catherine opens the door, an agent shows his badge. "Ma'am, we need to speak with Dr. Alexei Baranov." Catherine stared blankly at the agent. "You must have the wrong house. My husband is Robert Wilson." The agent's face remained impassive. "No, ma'am. His name is Alexei Baranov." For 40 years, Catherine and Robert Wilson had been the golden couple of their coastal Maine town. Their marriage was the standard against which others measured their own relationships. He was a respected marine biologist whose work on North Atlantic ecosystems had earned him tenure and international recognition. She was a beloved high school principal who had touched thousands of young lives. Each September, they celebrated their anniversary at the local lighthouse, an event that had become a community tradition. Young couples sought their advice on lasting love. Their children, James, a scientist, and Emily, a federal prosecutor, saw their parents' relationship as the gold standard. But beneath this perfect facade lay a secret so profound that when it finally surfaced, it would force Catherine to question everything she thought she knew about the man who had shared her bed for 4 decades. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from. September 1981, the small chapel in coastal Maine was filled with late summer light. Catherine Matthews, 25, walked down the aisle in her mother's restored wedding dress, her eyes fixed on the tall, somewhat serious man waiting at the altar. Robert Wilson, 28, was not from their town. He'd arrived just 18 months earlier to take a position at the Oceanographic Research Center. His Minnesota upbringing had given him a certain reserved quality that many mistook for coldness, but Catherine had discovered the warmth beneath. Their courtship had been swift but not impulsive. Robert had appeared in Catherine's third-grade classroom as a guest speaker, explaining tide pools to wide-eyed children. He'd stumbled over his words at first, clearly more comfortable with research than public speaking, but his knowledge had captivated the students. Afterward, Catherine had approached him with questions, and he'd invited her to tour the research facility. After the wedding, they settled into a small cottage near the shore. Robert's work at the Oceanographic Center focused on currents and ecosystems along the Maine coast, research that occasionally took him to conferences and field studies, but never for too long. Catherine continued teaching, her natural leadership eventually guiding her from classroom to administration. In 1983, their son James was born, a serious, thoughtful child who seemed to inherit his father's scientific mind. 3 years later came Emily, fiercely intelligent with a strong sense of justice that would eventually lead her to law school and the federal prosecutor's office. The Wilsons established traditions that became touchstones for their family and eventually the wider community. Most significant was their annual anniversary celebration at the Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. What began as a private ritual, Robert bringing a picnic basket and Catherine carrying a journal where they recorded their hopes for the coming year, gradually expanded. Friends asked to join. Young couples sought their advice. By their 25th anniversary, the lighthouse celebration had become a community event. Robert would give an impromptu lecture about the ocean's seasonal changes, and Catherine would organize games for children. They would cut a cake as neighbors toasted their example of enduring love. "Watch how they look at each other," people would whisper. 40 years together and still so in love. And they were in love. Catherine never doubted it. Robert was a devoted husband, not demonstrative in public, but attentive in countless small ways. He remembered dates, anticipated her needs, supported her career advancement. When she became principal of the high school in 2005, he arranged a surprise celebration, inviting former students whose lives she had touched. Of course, there were quirks in their marriage, as in any long relationship. Robert disliked having his photograph taken, a vanity, Catherine assumed, about his receding hairline and the glasses he'd needed since his 30s. He traveled each February to a marine biology symposium in different locations, always returning with small gifts and fascinating research updates. He had nightmares occasionally, thrashing in bed and muttering what Catherine assumed was nonsense until years later, when she would recognize it as Russian. Their children grew up and established their own lives. James followed his father into science, specializing in climate research. Emily's path to becoming a federal prosecutor began with a passionate sense of right and wrong that she credited to both parents. As they entered their 60s, Robert and Catherine settled into what they assumed would be the comfortable final chapters of their lives. Robert's research had earned him honors in the scientific community. Catherine's leadership had transformed her school into one of the best in the state. They had savings, good health, and the respect of everyone who knew them. Their 40th anniversary in September 2020 was smaller than usual due to the pandemic, but still special. Robert surprised Catherine with a delicate necklace featuring a lighthouse pendant. "To always guide you home," he said as he fastened it around her neck. 2 months later, Catherine climbed into their attic, searching for old family photos to compile into an anniversary album, a delayed project she thought would make a perfect Christmas gift. Behind a box of James's childhood science projects, she found a locked metal case she didn't recognize. The key was hidden beneath the case lining, as if someone wanted it to be found if necessary. Inside was a passport, Robert's face, but with a birth date 3 years different from what she knew, and stamps from countries he'd never mentioned visiting: Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, places behind what had once been the Iron Curtain. Catherine sat in the dusty attic, holding the passport, the first small thread that would eventually unravel 40 years of lies. "Robert?" Catherine called downstairs, the unfamiliar passport still in her hand. "Could you come up here for a moment?" She heard his footsteps on the stairs, methodical and unhurried as always. When he reached the attic doorway, his eyes immediately found the passport in her hands. For a fraction of a second, so brief Catherine would later question if she'd imagined it, something like fear flickered across his face before being replaced with mild confusion. "What's this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I found it in that metal case." Robert crossed the attic and took the passport, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh, this old thing," he said with a slight chuckle. "It's from that special research project I did in the late 70s, before we met." "But the dates," Catherine began. "Security clearance," Robert said, closing the passport. "Some of my early work overlapped with naval intelligence. Nothing classified exactly, but they issued special documentation with varied information for those of us traveling near sensitive waters during the Cold War." He slipped the passport into his pocket. "I'd forgotten I had this. Good thing you found it. I should have turned it in years ago." His explanation made sense, or at least Catherine wanted it to. The Cold War, government research, security protocols, these were all plausible reasons for the discrepancies. But something in his too casual tone, the way he'd pocketed the passport rather than continue discussing it, left a small knot of unease in her stomach. "I was looking for old photos," she said, changing the subject. "For an anniversary album. Always the sentimental one," Robert said with a smile, helping her up from the floor. "Let me help you look." The passport incident might have faded from Catherine's mind entirely, if not for what happened the following week at the faculty holiday dinner. The school's new technology teacher was an enthusiastic photographer who insisted on taking pictures of all the staff with their spouses. "Just one more, Dr. Wilson," the young teacher called as Robert subtly tried to step out of frame for the third time. "Robert hates having his picture taken," Catherine explained with a laugh. "Not hate," Robert corrected gently. "I just prefer being behind the camera rather than in front of it." But as they drove home that night, Catherine realized something that had never struck her before. "You know, in 40 years, I don't think we have a single clear photograph of you at a public event. Isn't that strange?" Robert kept his eyes on the snowy road. "Is it? I've never been comfortable being the center of attention. You know that. But even at James and Emily's graduations, you always volunteered to be the photographer." "Someone had to preserve the memories," he said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "And you're much more photogenic than I am, my dear." The conversation ended there, but Catherine's thoughts did not. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped out of bed and went to the study where their family albums were kept. Page after page confirmed her realization. Robert appeared in private family photos, vacations, Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues, but almost never in public settings. In 40 years of community events, he had skillfully, consistently avoided being photographed. It could still be simple camera shyness, Catherine told herself. Many people disliked being photographed, but combined with the passport and another peculiarity, she'd never fully questioned Robert's February trips every year. She felt the first serious stirrings of doubt. The February symposiums had been a fixture of their marriage. Robert would leave for a week, sometimes two, returning with research materials and small gifts. Catherine had never questioned these trips, assuming they were a standard part of academic life. Now, she tried to recall if he'd ever shown her conference programs or introduced her to colleagues he'd met there. December turned to January, and Catherine's unease grew. One evening, as they sat reading in the living room, a comfortable ritual of their retirement years, she casually mentioned a documentary she'd watched. It was fascinating, about the fall of the Soviet Union. Those were such tense times, weren't they? I can barely remember what it was like during the Cold War anymore. Robert glanced up from his journal. Yes, tense indeed. The program mentioned how Russian was taught in many American schools during that era. You studied French in college, didn't you? Yes, Robert replied, returning to his reading. Though I never became fluent. Romance languages weren't my strong suit. Catherine nodded, remembering something else. 2 years earlier, they had hosted a visiting Russian marine biologist for dinner. When the man had struggled with English, Robert had smoothly switched to what sounded like perfect Russian, carrying on an extended conversation. At the time, Catherine had been impressed, assuming he'd picked up the language through his international scientific collaborations. Now, she wondered. In late January, Their daughter Emily called with the news that she'd be coming for a visit in February. "It's been crazy at work," she explained. "This big espionage case I'm assisting with has taken over everything. We're investigating Soviet-era spies who might have embedded in coastal scientific communities decades ago and never left. Can you believe it? Like something out of a Cold War thriller." Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. "That sounds fascinating, honey. The really wild part is how they integrated. Some of them married Americans, had families, became respected members of their communities, all while sending information back to Moscow." After the call, Catherine noticed Robert standing in the doorway. "Emily's coming to visit," she said. "In February." "That's nice," he replied. "Unfortunately, I'll be at the symposium in San Diego that week. Emily would be disappointed to miss you. Could you reschedule? You've never missed your February trip before, but this is special." Robert frowned. "The symposium dates are fixed, Catherine. I'm presenting research. Emily will understand." "What's the topic this year?" The slightest hesitation. "Current variations in Gulf of Maine microclimates." "Why?" "Just curious," Catherine said. "Maybe I could come with you this time. I've never seen San Diego." "It would bore you to tears," Robert said, his tone light but firm. "Nothing but scientists talking about water temperature and salinity levels all day." Catherine smiled and let the subject drop. But that night, she did something she'd never done before in 40 years of marriage. While Robert slept, she took his phone from the nightstand and checked his emails. There was nothing about any symposium in San Diego. No hotel reservations, no conference registration, no communications with other scientists about a presentation. February arrived, and with it, Robert's departure. Catherine drove him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, and watched him walk toward the security checkpoint. Then, instead of leaving, she waited until he was through security and followed at a distance. He didn't go to the gate for San Diego. Instead, he boarded a flight to New York. While he was away, Catherine began her own investigation. She called the university where Robert had supposedly completed his undergraduate degree in Minnesota. After several transfers and a convincing story about updating alumni records, she learned something disturbing. Their records showed Robert Wilson had attended from 1972 to 1976, but they had no photograph on file, and the birth date they had recorded was different from the one Catherine knew, matching instead the date on the strange passport. Next, she dug through old papers in Robert's office. In their bottom drawer, beneath research notes, she found faded photographs from before they met. Robert looked younger, of course, but there was something subtly different about him, the way he held himself, perhaps, or the look in his eyes. Comparing these photos to their early marriage pictures, Catherine noticed small discrepancies. The formal way he stood in their wedding photos, as if uncomfortably playing a role, the careful smile that became more natural in later years. When Robert returned from his trip, Catherine said nothing about her discoveries. But that night, as they prepared for bed, she asked, "How was the presentation?" "Fine," he replied, arranging his clothes for the morning. "The usual academic politics, but the research was well received." "And how was the weather in San Diego?" "Typical Southern California, sunny and mild." Catherine nodded, turning away so he wouldn't see her face. The weather in San Diego that week had been unusually rainy with flash flooding. She'd checked. The next morning, while Robert was in the shower, Catherine searched his suitcase. Tucked into a side pocket was a handwritten note in what looked like Russian and a subway ticket from New York City. No conference materials, no name badge, nothing to suggest he'd been at an academic symposium at all. She was taking a photo of the note with her phone when Robert's voice came from behind her. "What are you doing?" Catherine turned, startled. Robert stood in the doorway, half-dressed, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. "I could ask you the same thing," she said, finding courage she didn't know she had. "Where were you really last week? And why have you lied to me about it, about so many things for 40 years? For a moment, Robert said nothing. The silence between them felt like an abyss opening, destroying the foundation of their marriage. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, slightly harder, with the faintest trace of an accent she'd never noticed before. "You wouldn't understand, Catherine, and you don't want to. Trust me on this. Let it go." "Let it go?" she repeated, incredulous. "You've been lying to me our entire marriage. Not about what matters." His expression softened. "Never about what matters. How would I know that? How would I know what's real anymore?" Catherine felt tears forming. "Who are you, Robert? Who have I been married to for 40 years? He took a step toward her, but she backed away. Something in his eyes frightened her. Not cruelty, but a sudden glimpse of someone capable of things the Robert she knew would never do. "I have loved you every day since we met," he said quietly. "That has never been a lie." "Then tell me the truth." "I can't." He closed his suitcase. "And if you care about our family, about James and Emily, about yourself, you won't pursue this further." It was the first serious argument of their 40-year marriage. Catherine left the house, driving aimlessly along the coast, her mind racing with questions and suspicions. By the time she returned that evening, Robert had gone to his campus office, leaving a note saying he would sleep there to give her space. But Catherine no longer wanted space. She wanted answers. She called Emily, now back in Washington, D.C., and asked, trying to sound casual, about the espionage case she'd mentioned. "I can't discuss details, Mom," Emily said, "but we've identified several persons of interest. These people were essentially ghosts. They assumed the identities of real Americans who had died or disappeared, built entire lives here, and meanwhile passed information to their handlers for years." How were they discovered?" Catherine asked, her hands trembling. "Advanced facial recognition, mostly. Comparing old photographs with Soviet military and intelligence archives we've only recently gained access to. Plus, there are patterns, behavioral signatures that, once you know what to look for, are surprisingly consistent." After the call, Catherine sat at her kitchen table, staring at the lighthouse pendant Robert had given her for their anniversary. 40 years of memories played through her mind. Robert teaching James to fish, Robert comforting Emily after her first heartbreak, Robert bringing Catherine tea every morning and remembering exactly how she liked it. Could she be wrong? Could her suspicions be the product of an overactive imagination or some midlife crisis? Perhaps there were innocent explanations for everything: the passport, the Russian note, the lies about the symposium. But deep down, Catherine knew. The man she had loved for 40 years, had children with, had built a life around, that man was a stranger. The next day, Robert returned home, acting as if their argument had never happened. He was especially attentive, bringing home Catherine's favorite pastries and suggesting they plan a summer trip to Paris to practice my terrible French, he joked, with a meaningful look that seemed to be testing whether she would confront him again. Catherine played along, smiling and discussing potential itineraries. But inside, she felt cold terror. Whoever her husband really was, he now knew she suspected something. And although she couldn't bring herself to believe Robert would hurt her, the stranger behind his eyes might be capable of anything. For the next several weeks, they maintained a facade of normalcy that felt like the cruelest parody of their once happy marriage. Catherine pretended to accept his explanations and apologized for her overreaction. Robert seemed relieved, though a new wariness remained between them. They spoke about trivial things and avoided being alone together for too long. All the while, Catherine waited, watching for more clues, unsure what to do with her suspicions. Should she confront him again? Go to the authorities? With what evidence? A strange passport, a subway ticket, inconsistent birth dates? She had no proof of any crime, only the growing certainty that her life was built on lies. Then, in early April, Emily called again. Her voice was tense, professional in a way Catherine had never heard before. "Mom, I'm coming home next week. There are things we need to discuss, in person. Is everything all right?" A pause. "Just don't tell Dad I'm coming, okay? Tell him you're having a girls' day with some friends from school. Can you do that?" "Emily, you're scaring me." "Everything will be fine, Mom. I promise. We'll figure this out together." After hanging up, Catherine looked out the window to where Robert was tending to their garden, methodically weeding around the spring bulbs, his movements precise and familiar. For a moment, she saw him as he'd been in 1981, the serious young scientist who'd captured her heart, who'd raised their children with such care, who'd built a life that, until recently, had felt so solid. She wondered if she would ever see him that way again. The morning of April 15, 2021 began like any other. Robert made coffee while Catherine prepared toast and fruit for breakfast. They discussed mundane things: a leak in the upstairs bathroom, whether the azaleas would bloom early this year. Robert mentioned he'd be working late at the university lab. "Don't wait up," he said, kissing her cheek before leaving. "These water samples won't analyze themselves." Catherine nodded, thinking of Emily, who would arrive at noon. She had no idea what her daughter planned to tell her, but the knot of dread in her stomach had grown tighter each day. At 11:30, Catherine was vacuuming the guest room when she heard vehicles on the gravel driveway. Looking out the window, she saw not Emily's car but 3 black SUVs pulling up to their house. Men in dark suits emerged, and Catherine recognized her daughter among them, her face set in a professional mask Catherine had never seen before. Catherine's hands trembled as she opened the front door. "Mrs. Wilson?" A tall man with gray-streaked hair stepped forward, showing identification. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Delgado with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Is your husband home?" "No, he's at work," Catherine replied, her voice barely audible. "What is this about?" Emily moved to her side, taking her arm. "Mom, we need to come in and talk." Inside, Agent Delgado explained that they had a warrant to search the Wilson home. Other agents were simultaneously searching Robert's university office and laboratory. "Mrs. Wilson, when do you expect your husband to return?" Delgado asked. Before Catherine could answer, the front door opened. Robert stood in the entrance, his face draining of color as he took in the scene. Federal agents in his living room, his wife and daughter sitting close together on the sofa. "Dr. Alexei Baranov?" Agent Delgado said, rising to his feet. Catherine watched in stunned silence as Robert's posture changed subtly. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, and when he spoke, his voice carried a faint accent she'd never heard in 40 years of marriage. "I would like a moment with my wife," he said, not acknowledging the name. "Sir, we have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of espionage, identity theft, and immigration fraud," Delgado continued. "You have the right to remain silent." "Please," Robert interrupted, his eyes fixed on Catherine. "1 minute." Delgado glanced at Emily, who gave a small nod. The agent stepped back slightly but remained watchful. Robert crossed the room and knelt before Catherine, taking her hands in his. "Catherine, listen to me. Everything I've done since meeting you has been real. Everything." Catherine stared at the face she thought she knew better than her own. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm the man who has loved you for 40 years, he replied. "The rest is complicated, but that part is true." Before she could respond, agents moved forward and handcuffed Robert. As they led him away, he looked back once. "Take care of her," he said to Emily, who stood rigid and pale. Through the front window, Catherine watched neighbors gathering on the street, phones raised to record the scene as federal agents escorted her husband to one of the waiting vehicles. Mrs. Henderson from next door rushed across the lawn, her face full of concern. "Catherine, what's happening? Why are they taking Robert?" Catherine couldn't answer. The world had become distant and hazy, as if she were underwater, struggling to reach the surface. Emily guided her back inside, away from curious eyes and whispered questions. "Mom, sit down. You need to drink something. Did you know?" Catherine asked, finally finding her voice. "Is this why you came home?" Emily's professional demeanor cracked, revealing the daughter beneath the prosecutor. "I only realized a few weeks ago. We were reviewing surveillance photographs for my case, and I saw Dad. Except it wasn't Dad, not really. It was a man called Alexei Baranov, photographed in 1979 during Soviet military training." "This can't be happening," Catherine whispered. Agent Delgado returned from supervising the search of the house. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand this is extremely difficult, but we need to ask you some questions." "Not now," Emily said firmly. "My mother is in shock. Questions can wait until tomorrow." "Emily," Delgado said gently, "you know the protocol. Initial statements need to be taken immediately, while memories are fresh." "My memories of 40 years with that man are plenty fresh," Catherine said, a spark of anger cutting through her numbness. "But I don't know anything useful. Clearly, I never did." The next 24 hours passed in a blur. Emily stayed close, fielding phone calls and turning away neighbors and reporters who came to the door. James flew in from Chicago, his face ashen with disbelief. "This has to be a mistake," he kept saying. "Dad is the most honest person I know." Catherine said nothing. What could she say? That she'd suspected something was wrong for months but had been too afraid to truly face it? That part of her still couldn't believe the man she'd built her life with was a Soviet spy? The following morning, Agent Delgado returned, this time with a female agent who introduced herself as Dr. Claire Winters, a specialist in Soviet-era intelligence operations. They sat at Catherine's kitchen table, the same table where Robert had helped James with science projects and where Emily had studied for the bar exam. "Mrs. Wilson, what we're about to share with you is difficult," Dr. Winters began, "but we believe you deserve to know the truth." She opened a folder containing photographs and documents. "This is Alexei Mikhailovich Baranov, born 1953 in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He was recruited by the KGB in 1974 while studying marine biology. His excellent English and scientific aptitude made him an ideal candidate for deep cover operations in the United States." Catherine stared at the black and white photograph of a young man in military uniform. The face was unmistakably Robert's, but younger, harder somehow. In 1981, Baranov was deployed to the United States as part of a program called Operation Neptune. Dr. Winters continued. The KGB had identified several coastal research facilities conducting work with potential naval applications. Your town's oceanographic center was one of them. "And Robert Wilson?" Catherine asked, her voice hollow. "The real Robert Wilson?" Agent Delgado slid another document forward. "Robert James Wilson died in a hiking accident in Minnesota in February 1981. His body wasn't discovered for several months. By then, Baranov had assumed his identity and established himself in Maine." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to process what she was hearing. "So everything, our meeting, our marriage, it was all planned?" Dr. Winters hesitated. "We believe your initial meeting was orchestrated, yes. As a respected teacher with deep community ties, you would have been identified as someone who could help establish his cover identity." The words struck Catherine like physical blows. Even their first meeting, Robert visiting her classroom. His shy smile as he explained tide pools to her students had been calculated, a performance designed to draw her in. Did he? Were there others? Catherine asked, not entirely sure what she was asking. Other women, other families in different places? No, Dr. Winters said firmly. As far as we can determine, Alexei Baranov maintained only the Robert Wilson identity from 1981 onward. What about his work? Was that all a lie too? Was he even really a scientist? That part appears to be genuine. Baranov was a trained marine biologist. His research publications are legitimate scientific contributions. However, his position gave him access to information about coastal defenses, submarine activities, and eventually, as his reputation grew, classified research. Catherine thought of the countless evenings Robert had spent in his home office, writing research papers and reading scientific journals. Had he been encoding secrets in those papers, using his position to gather intelligence? The idea seemed both outlandish and, suddenly, obvious. What happens now? James asked, speaking for the first time since the agents arrived. Your father, Mr. Baranov, is being held at a federal facility in Portsmouth, Agent Delgado explained. He's facing multiple charges, including espionage against the United States. Espionage carries a potential death penalty, Emily said quietly, her legal training evident in her precise language. That outcome is unlikely in this case, Dr. Winters interjected, particularly given the time frame. Most of Baranov's intelligence activities appear to have occurred during the Cold War era, prior to 1991. You mean he stopped spying after the Soviet Union collapsed? Catherine asked. That's our current assessment, though the investigation is ongoing. It appears that when the USSR fell, Baranov's handlers essentially abandoned him. He was a ghost, a non-existent person with no way to return to a home that no longer existed. The idea of Robert, Alexei, continuing his life in Maine after being abandoned by his country, struck Catherine as profoundly sad. Had he considered running, assuming yet another identity, or had he already become Robert Wilson in all the ways that mattered? I want to see him, Catherine said suddenly. Emily looked alarmed. Mom, I don't think that's a good idea right now. I've been married to this man for 40 years, Catherine said firmly. I deserve answers that aren't in your files. I need to hear it from him. Agent Delgado exchanged glances with Dr. Winters. It might be possible to arrange a supervised meeting in a few days, after initial processing is complete. After the agents left, the house fell silent. James went for a walk along the shore, needing space to process. Emily made phone calls in the guest room, her voice a low murmur. Catherine sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by photographs of her family, all of them featuring a man who had never really existed. That evening, the phone rang constantly. Friends, colleagues, even former students called offering support and expressing disbelief. Catherine let the answering machine take the messages. What could she possibly say to anyone? Night fell, and for the first time in decades, Catherine prepared for bed alone. Robert's pajamas still hung on the back of the bathroom door. His reading glasses sat on his nightstand, beside the half-finished novel he'd been reading. Ordinary objects that now seemed like artifacts from a stranger. Sleep eluded her. Around midnight, Catherine went to Robert's study, driven by a need to understand. The FBI had taken his computer and many of his papers, but they'd left the bookshelves untouched. She ran her fingers along the spines of scientific texts and journals, wondering if there were clues hidden among them. Behind a row of bound research periodicals, she found a small, leather-bound book. Inside were handwritten notes in what she now recognized as Russian. The writing was cramped and methodical, dating back to 1981, the year they met. Though she couldn't read the words, she recognized numbers and dates that corresponded to Robert's early research trips. As she turned the pages, the entries became less frequent. The last dated entry was from December 1991, the month the Soviet Union officially dissolved. After that, the Russian writing stopped. The remaining entries were in English, and they were not about research or intelligence. They were about her, about their children. James received Westinghouse Science Award today. Catherine so proud, she cried. I find myself proud too, not as assignment but as father. Strange feeling. Emily leaving for law school. Catherine pretending to be fine, but I know she will cry after drop-off. We'll make her favorite dinner tonight. 25th anniversary. Wonder sometimes what Handler would think of my life now. Cannot remember his face clearly anymore. Catherine's face. Every line, every expression. This I know better than my own. Catherine closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Was this proof that some part of their marriage had been real? Or just another layer of deception? Notes Alexei kept to maintain his cover story. 3 days later, Catherine was permitted to visit Robert at the detention facility. Emily insisted on accompanying her, though she wasn't allowed in the interview room itself. Agent Delgado would be present, along with Robert's newly appointed federal defender. The facility was stark and institutional. Catherine was photographed, her identity verified, her belongings stored in a locker. She followed a guard down sterile corridors until they reached a small room with a table and 4 chairs. Robert was already seated when she entered. He wore a tan jumpsuit with a number stenciled on the pocket. His hands were cuffed in front of him. He looked older somehow, diminished by his surroundings, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Catherine," he said, starting to rise before the guard motioned him back down. She sat across from him, Agent Delgado and the defense attorney on either side. For a long moment neither spoke. "They told you who I am," Robert finally said. "It wasn't a question. They told me who you were," Catherine corrected. "I don't know who you are now." Robert nodded slowly. "That's fair. Ask me anything. I'll tell you the truth. Were you ever going to tell me?" He looked down at his hands. "I don't know. I considered it many times over the years, especially after the Soviet Union fell. But I was afraid, not just of the legal consequences, but of losing you, and later, of what it would do to James and Emily. So our entire relationship was a mission. An assignment?" The word burned in her mouth. "At the beginning, yes," Robert admitted, his accent now slightly noticeable. "You were identified as an ideal contact for me, respected in the community, connected to local families, including those with naval ties. And our marriage? That wasn't in the original plan." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I was supposed to establish a social relationship with you, nothing more. When I realized I was falling in love, my handlers were initially displeased. Then they saw advantages. A family man raises fewer suspicions." "How generous of them," Catherine said bitterly. "Catherine," Robert leaned forward, his cuffed hands reaching slightly toward hers, though he stopped short of touching her. "I want you to understand something. Yes, our meeting was orchestrated, but everything that followed, my love for you, our life together, that became real. So real that by the time the Soviet Union collapsed and I was effectively abandoned by my handlers, I felt relieved. I could just be Robert Wilson, your husband, father to our children. Except you weren't Robert Wilson. You've never been Robert Wilson. Names are just words," he said quietly. "The man who loved you for 40 years, that's who I am. Alexei, Robert, these are just labels." Catherine studied his face, the face she'd woken up beside for 4 decades, the face that had aged alongside hers, bearing new lines and wrinkles that told the story of their shared life. Was he lying even now? Was he such a skilled operative that he could fabricate emotion perfectly for 40 years? "I kept information flowing to my handlers until 1991, Robert continued, seemingly determined to hide nothing now. "Mostly about naval movements, research with military applications, coastal defense systems. After the Soviet collapse, there was no one to report to. I received one final communication instructing me to maintain my cover and await further orders that never came." "And you just, decided to continue being Robert Wilson?" "By then, I had been Robert longer than I had ever been Alexei. My life in Russia seemed distant, like a half-remembered dream. You, James, Emily, you were my reality." "Were there others?" Catherine asked, echoing her question to Dr. Winters. "Other women?" Robert shook his head. "No, only you, ever." "Did you have a family in Russia? People who believed you were dead?" A shadow crossed his face. "My parents died when I was young. I had a sister, Natasha, and a fiancée, Irina. They would have been told I died in a training accident." The mention of a fiancée hit Catherine like a physical blow. Another woman, in another country, who had mourned the man sitting before her. "Did you love her, this Irina?" "I thought I did once," Robert said softly, "but I was very young. What I felt for her doesn't compare to what grew between us, Catherine. You have to believe that." "I don't have to believe anything you say ever again," Catherine replied, though without the heat she'd intended. She was too exhausted for anger. Agent Delgado cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to inform you that we've uncovered several hiding places in your home that contained espionage equipment. A radio transmitter concealed in the garden shed, microfilm hidden in the basement ceiling. Relics," Robert said quickly. "I haven't used any of that equipment since 1991. The lab is still analyzing everything," Delgado continued. "But preliminary findings support Mr. Baranov's claim that active espionage ceased around the time of the Soviet collapse." The defense attorney, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke for the first time. "My client has been cooperating fully. He's provided information about Soviet intelligence operations that could be valuable to national security, even decades later." "Trying to save your own skin?" Catherine asked Robert. "Trying to give our children a chance to visit their father somewhere other than a maximum security prison," he replied simply. Catherine felt tears threatening and fought them back. "Our children," she repeated. "Do you have any idea what this has done to them?" James is in denial, convinced this is all some terrible mistake. "And Emily, God. Emily was working on the very case that exposed you. Do you know what that's doing to her career?" To her sense of who she is? Pain flashed across Robert's face. I never wanted to hurt any of you. You have to know that. I don't know anything anymore, Catherine said, rising from her chair. I don't know if our marriage was real. I don't know if the man I loved ever existed. I don't even know who I am, if everything I believed about my life was a lie. As she turned to leave, Robert called after her. Catherine, please, ask me anything, any detail about our life together. I remember everything. The song that was playing when we danced at our wedding. The color of the dress you wore when Emily was born. The exact words you said to me on our 25th anniversary. It was all real to me. All of it. Catherine paused at the door, not looking back. The problem isn't what you remember, Robert. It's what you made me forget, that the man I married never existed at all. The weeks following Robert's arrest brought chaos to a life that had once been defined by its calm predictability. Reporters camped at the end of Catherine's driveway, shouting questions whenever she emerged. Neighbors brought casseroles and concerned glances, though some stopped calling altogether, as if espionage might be contagious. Catherine took a leave of absence from her position as principal. How could she guide young people when her own moral compass had been so thoroughly shattered? The school board was supportive but clearly relieved by her decision. Having the wife of an accused Soviet spy leading their school created complications no one wanted to navigate. James returned to Chicago after a week, still insisting there must be some explanation beyond the obvious. Dad is not a spy, he repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. There's been a mistake, or he was forced into something he didn't understand. Emily's situation was more complicated. Her involvement in the case that had exposed her own father created a professional nightmare. She was removed from the investigation due to the obvious conflict of interest, and colleagues who had once respected her now eyed her with suspicion. Had she known? Had she somehow been compromised? I'm being vetted and investigated as if I were a security risk, she told Catherine during one of their nightly calls. 29 years of exemplary service, and suddenly I'm treated like a potential double agent because of who my father turned out to be. Catherine listened, offering what comfort she could while wrestling with her own demons. She'd begun having nightmares, dreams where Robert spoke to her in Russian, where their wedding photos changed to show a stranger's face, where she opened her own wrists to find Soviet circuits and wires instead of blood. To quiet her mind, Catherine turned to investigation. If Robert, Alexei, had hidden things from her for 40 years, what might she discover now that she was truly looking? She started in his study, methodically examining every book, every file, every memento. Behind a loose baseboard, she found a small cache of items. A tarnished Orthodox cross, a folded photograph of a young woman, Irina, his sister, and several Russian coins, relics of Alexei Baranov, preserved by a man who had supposedly become Robert Wilson. In the attic, Catherine discovered a powerful shortwave radio concealed inside an old stereo cabinet. The FBI had missed it during their search. She left it untouched, afraid of what she might learn if she reported it. Most disturbing was what she found in their bedroom. Inside a hollow bedpost, one she'd touched every night for 40 years, was a small journal written entirely in a complex cipher. Catherine brought it to Emily, who reluctantly passed it to her former colleagues. The encryption was sophisticated, they told her, definitely KGB methodology. When decoded, the journal proved to be a record of intelligence gathered between 1981 and 1991. Naval ship movements, research breakthroughs with military applications, profiles of scientists and military personnel, including notes on vulnerabilities, drinking problems, marital difficulties, financial troubles that could potentially be exploited. He was watching everyone, Catherine said hollowly when Emily shared the findings, assessing them as targets while smiling at their dinner tables. But the journal contained something else too, personal entries, written in a different cipher, that began around 1985 and grew more frequent over time. These pages revealed doubts, conflicts between duty and growing attachment, concerns about bringing children into a life built on deception, assignment compromised by genuine attachment. One entry from 1984 read, "Handler suggests termination and reassignment. I resisted, assured him emotional involvement creates more convincing cover. Privately, cannot imagine leaving C now, regardless of mission." Catherine didn't know whether to find comfort in these entries or see them as yet another layer of manipulation. Could she trust anything this man had written, even in a private journal he never expected anyone to read? Meanwhile, the legal machinery ground forward. Robert's attorney negotiated with prosecutors, offering intelligence on old Soviet operations in exchange for leniency. The case was complicated by time. Many of the crimes had occurred decades ago, when the Soviet Union still existed. Proving current espionage was difficult, especially since evidence suggested activity had ceased after 1991. In July, Catherine received a call from Agent Delgado. "Mrs. Wilson, your husband has requested to see you again." He says there are things he needs to explain that he couldn't before. It's entirely your decision. Catherine hesitated, but curiosity won out. 3 days later, she again sat across from Robert in the detention facility. He looked thinner, grayer, but somehow more at peace than during their first meeting. "Thank you for coming," he said, his accent now unmistakably Russian, as if he'd stopped trying to hide it. "I promised you truth, and there are things you should know." "More confessions?" Catherine asked. "Context," he replied. "You found my journals, yes? The coded ones?" Catherine nodded. "Then you know I stopped sending intelligence after the Soviet Union collapsed. What you don't know is that I had begun withholding information years earlier, sending less than I could have, protecting people I had come to care about. You want credit for being a less effective spy?" A small smile crossed his face. "No, I want you to understand how my feelings for you for our life changed me. When I arrived in America, I was a committed officer. I believed in the mission. But living here, loving you, raising our children, I began to see beyond ideology. Is that supposed to comfort me? That you developed a conscience after spying for a decade? It's not about comfort, Catherine. It's about truth. You asked who you were sleeping beside for 40 years. I'm trying to tell you, it was a man caught between worlds. A man who began as one person and became another. And now? Who are you now, Alexei? I'm the same man who loved you yesterday, whatever name you call me." He leaned forward. "Catherine, there's something else you should know. Something I've never told anyone. More secrets? I'm shocked. This one you'll want to hear," he said quietly. "I was ordered to abandon the mission in 1989. The Soviet Union was already crumbling. Resources were being reallocated. My handler told me to extract, to return to Russia before things collapsed entirely." Catherine stared at him. "But you didn't." "No, I chose to stay. I chose you, our children, our life. I told my handler I needed more time to gather critical intelligence. I falsified reports to buy months, then years. By the time anyone might have followed up, the whole system had collapsed. You expect me to believe you chose to be a stranded spy in enemy territory rather than go home? Home?" Robert, Alexei, shook his head. "Russia hadn't been home for years by then. You were my home, Catherine. You and the children, the life we built. I couldn't leave that, even if it meant living with the constant fear of exposure." Catherine wanted to dismiss his words as more manipulation, but they resonated with something she'd always felt in their marriage, a profound devotion that sometimes seemed almost desperate, as if he were clinging to their life together like a drowning man to a raft. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, "then you betrayed your country for us. For myself too," he admitted. "I couldn't go back to being Alexei Baranov, not after being Robert Wilson for so long. That life, that person, felt foreign to me." "But you kept the mementos," Catherine said. "The cross, the photograph. You never fully let Alexei go. Would you completely erase your past, Catherine? No matter what led you to where you are, it shapes you. I couldn't forget who I had been, even as I chose who to become." As she left the detention facility, Catherine felt more confused than ever. The lines between truth and lies, between Robert and Alexei, seemed increasingly blurred. Had she spent 40 years with a dedicated Soviet agent playing a role, or with a man who had begun as one thing and genuinely become another? Back home, Catherine found Emily waiting in the kitchen. "How did it go?" she asked. "He says he chose to stay here rather than return to Russia when ordered to," Catherine replied. "That he chose us over his mission." Emily nodded slowly. "That actually matches some intelligence assessments. There's evidence he was slated for extraction around 1989, 1990, but somehow managed to remain in place. Do you think he's telling the truth about any of it?" Emily was silent for a long moment. "I've been looking into his case from both sides as his daughter and as someone who understands espionage operations. The pattern is unusual. Most deep-cover agents either maintain absolute loyalty to their mission or defect openly for protection. Dad," she stumbled over the word, "he seems to have done neither. He just became Robert Wilson, for all intents and purposes. Except he kept gathering intelligence. Until around 1991, yes. And even then, the intelligence from the late 80s was increasingly limited, focused on less sensitive areas. It's as if he was gradually winding down his operation while maintaining just enough activity to justify his continued placement." Catherine sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I don't know how to make sense of any of this, Emily. How do I reconcile 40 years of marriage with this revelation? How do I know what was real?" "Maybe everything was real," Emily suggested quietly. "Maybe he was both, the spy who came to gather intelligence, and the man who fell in love and built a life here. People contain multitudes, Mom, even people who aren't foreign agents." The next day, a letter arrived from Robert's attorney. The prosecutors had offered a plea deal. Robert would plead guilty to reduced charges of espionage and identity fraud. In exchange for his continued cooperation with intelligence agencies, and in recognition of the historical nature of his activities, he would receive a 5-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 3 years. They're essentially acknowledging that he's a relic of a bygone era, Emily explained. His intelligence value now is historical rather than current, and there's little public safety benefit to a lengthy incarceration. 5 years, Catherine murmured. He'd be 73 when released. If he serves the full term, yes, but with good behavior and continued cooperation, he could be out in 3. And then what? He comes home as if nothing happened? We pick up where we left off? Emily shrugged helplessly. That's for you to decide, Mom. No one expects you to stay married to him after all this. But that was the question that haunted Catherine most. Could she, should she, remain married to a man who had deceived her so profoundly? Would divorcing him be a surrender to the lie, an admission that their entire marriage had been false? Or would staying be a form of self-deception, a desperate attempt to preserve what had never truly existed? In August, Catherine made a pilgrimage to Minnesota. She needed to see for herself the grave of the real Robert Wilson, the man whose identity her husband had stolen. She found it in a small cemetery outside Minneapolis, a simple headstone marking the brief life of a promising young scientist who had died at 28, never knowing that his name and identity would live on for decades. Standing by the grave, Catherine felt an odd connection to this stranger. Had the real Robert Wilson been kind, intelligent? Would she have loved him too? Or was it something unique to Alexei Baranov, playing the role of Robert, that had captured her heart? While in Minnesota, Catherine met with a former KGB officer who had defected in the 1980s and now consulted for U.S. intelligence. He had reviewed Robert's, Alexei's, file and agreed to speak with her, not as an agent but as one human to another. Your husband was considered extremely promising, the man told her over coffee in a quiet restaurant. Intelligent, disciplined, idealistic. He truly believed he was serving a noble cause. Stealing another man's life? Deceiving an entire community? That was noble? The former officer sighed. You must understand the mindset. To Alexei, America was the existential enemy. The Cold War wasn't just politics. It was a fight for the future of humanity. At least, that's what we were taught to believe. Did you know him? Before? We trained together briefly. He was serious, dedicated, not particularly sociable but respected for his capabilities. His scientific background made him especially valuable. He could genuinely contribute in his cover field while gathering intelligence. And was it normal to arrange marriages as part of a cover? The man hesitated. Not marriages, typically. Relationships, yes. We were encouraged to integrate fully into communities, which often meant romantic entanglements. But marriage, children, these were complications. They created vulnerabilities, divided loyalties. Then why was he allowed to marry me? I can only speculate, but if the relationship proved particularly valuable for his cover and access, his handlers might have approved despite the risks. The man studied her face. Or perhaps he made that decision himself, against protocol, because his feelings for you outweighed his training. As Catherine drove back to Maine, she thought about love, how it grows, how it changes people, how it creates truth even in the midst of lies. Had Alexei Baranov truly become Robert Wilson through loving her? Or had Robert Wilson always been a performance, maintained for 40 years with inhuman dedication? And what of her own identity? Was she Catherine Wilson, devoted wife and mother? Catherine Matthews, who had been targeted and deceived? Or someone new entirely? A woman forced to recreate herself from the shattered pieces of a life she thought she understood. By October, the initial shock had faded, leaving Catherine in a strange limbo. Robert had accepted the plea deal and begun serving his sentence at a medium-security federal facility in Pennsylvania. The reporters had mostly moved on to newer scandals, though occasionally journalists still called seeking interviews for books or documentaries about Cold War espionage. Catherine had returned to work, finding comfort in the structured routine of school administration. Her colleagues were supportive, though conversations sometimes faltered when she entered a room. The students, surprisingly, were the most accepting. To them, having a principal whose husband turned out to be a Soviet spy was more fascinating than scandalous. James and Emily had processed the revelation in their own ways. James immersed himself in scientific research, as if proving his professional worth could somehow separate him from his father's deception. Emily took a leave from the Justice Department and joined a private law firm, needing distance from the agency that had exposed their family secret. Both children had visited Robert in prison. James went regularly, bringing journals and engaging his father in discussions about climate research, carefully avoiding any mention of espionage or deception. Emily's visits were less frequent and more difficult, but she went out of a sense of duty and lingering love. Catherine had not returned since their conversation in August. Instead, she wrote letters, dozens of them, questions about his past, about their marriage, about choices made and paths not taken. Robert answered each one with painstaking honesty, or what seemed like honesty. He told her about his childhood in Leningrad, about his parents, both teachers, not dead as he'd first claimed, about his sister Natasha, who had become a doctor. He described his recruitment and training, his initial mission parameters, his first impressions of America, so bright, so loud, so wasteful, yet so vibrant and optimistic too. He wrote about meeting Catherine, about being instructed to cultivate her as a community contact, about reporting back that she would make an ideal long-term asset through romantic attachment. My handler asked if I could maintain such a deception indefinitely, Robert wrote. I said yes, believing it would be just another aspect of my mission. I didn't understand then that the deception would become its own truth, that loving you would transform me more thoroughly than any training ever could. In October, Catherine received a call from the prison. Robert had fallen ill with pneumonia and been transferred to the medical ward. Though not critical, his condition was serious enough to warrant notification of family. Catherine sat with the information for a full day before making her decision. The next morning, she drove to Pennsylvania, arriving at the prison as visiting hours began. Robert was surprised to see her, his eyes brightening despite his obvious weakness. "You came?" he said, his voice hoarse from coughing. "I wasn't sure I would," Catherine admitted, sitting beside his bed. "But 40 years of habit is hard to break. When someone says your husband is ill, you go to him. I'm still your husband then?" "Legally, yes. The rest, I'm still figuring out." They talked for hours, about James and Emily, about the town's reaction, about Catherine's return to work, mundane topics, safe topics, until Robert's coughing interrupted their conversation. As Catherine handed him water, their fingers brushed, the first physical contact since his arrest 6 months earlier. Something familiar and unwelcome flickered in Catherine's heart: concern, tenderness, the muscle memory of 4 decades caring for this man. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked suddenly. "After the Soviet Union fell, when there was no one left to report to, why keep the secret?" Robert sipped the water slowly before answering. "Fear, at first. Fear of prosecution, of losing everything. Then shame. How could I tell you our beginning was a lie? The longer I waited, the more impossible it seemed." He set the cup down. "And selfishness too. I wanted to protect what we had. I convinced myself that Robert Wilson had become more real than Alexei Baranov ever was." "Was any of it real? Us? All of it?" he said without hesitation. "My feelings for you were never an assignment, Catherine. They became real so quickly that it frightened me. By our first anniversary, I was compromised, torn between my mission and my heart. And our children? Were they part of your mission too?" Pain crossed his face. "Never. James and Emily were unexpected blessings. My handlers were concerned about permanent attachments. Children were not in the operational plan." "But you insisted?" Catherine guessed, remembering his journal entries about resistance to his handlers. "I told them a family man draws less suspicion. In truth, I wanted what other men had, a wife I loved, children of my own, things I'd been taught to sacrifice for the greater good." He met her eyes. "I wanted our family, Catherine." As she drove home that evening, Catherine felt a shifting in her understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that the truth was more complex than simply spy versus husband. The man she had known as Robert Wilson was neither entirely Alexei, the devoted Soviet agent, nor entirely a fabrication. He was, perhaps, a third entity, someone forged in the crucible of deception, who had ultimately found authenticity in the very life he'd been sent to infiltrate. Over the next several months, Catherine visited Robert regularly. Each time, they peeled back another layer of their shared history, examining it from both perspectives, what she had experienced versus what had actually been happening. Some revelations were painful. Robert confessed that their chance meeting had been orchestrated after weeks of surveillance to determine her routines and interests. Other discoveries were strangely comforting. The weekend trip where he'd proposed had been entirely unplanned, a genuine impulse born of emotion rather than strategy. In January 2022, almost a year after Robert's arrest, Catherine made her decision. She drove to the prison carrying divorce papers and a small suitcase. Robert saw the papers first when she placed them on the table between them. "I understand," he said quietly. "You deserve a fresh start, unburdened by my deception." "I didn't say I was filing for divorce," Catherine replied. "I brought these to show you that I've considered all options. I've thought about walking away, about legally ending our marriage and trying to build something new. But I've realized something. For 40 years, I was married to a man who didn't exist, or so I thought. Now I understand that's not quite true. Robert Wilson did exist, not as the man born with that name, but as the person you became, the scientist, the husband, the father. Those parts were real, perhaps more real than Alexei Baranov ever was." Robert listened, his expression guarded, as if afraid to hope. I can't erase 40 years of shared life, Catherine continued. I can't pretend we didn't raise children together, build a home together, love each other through sickness and health, and I don't want to try. What are you saying? I'm saying I choose to stay married to the man I know, whatever his name might be. Not because I've forgiven the deception, but because I believe the love that grew from it was genuine, is genuine. She reached across the table and took his hands. I'm saying that when you're released, we'll face whatever comes next together. It won't be easy, it won't be the same, but it will be real, perhaps more real than before, because now there are no more secrets between us. Robert's eyes filled with tears, the first Catherine had seen from him in 40 years of marriage. I don't deserve this chance. Probably not, Catherine agreed with a small smile. But love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing, day after day. And I'm choosing to believe that the life we built matters more than how it began. 4 years later, in September 2026, a small group gathered at Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. Robert Wilson, now officially Alexei Wilson after a legal name change, stood beside Catherine, both of them showing the signs of their 70-plus years but standing tall. James and Emily were there with their own families, including grandchildren who knew a simplified version of their grandfather's complicated history. Several neighbors and longtime friends had come too, some who had stood by Catherine during the darkest days, and others who had initially pulled away but gradually returned to the fold. This was not the community-wide celebration of anniversaries past, but it was something perhaps more meaningful, a gathering of people who had seen the worst and chosen to find the best. As the sun began to set, Catherine and Alexei walked to the point they had visited every year for more than 4 decades. He moved more slowly now, the years in prison having aged him beyond his chronological age. 45 years, Catherine said, looking out at the Atlantic. Who would have thought it possible, given how we began? I did, Alexei replied, his accent now a natural blend of Russian and Maine that he no longer tried to hide. Not at first, perhaps, but somewhere along the way, I began to believe in us more than anything else in my life. Catherine took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth that had comforted her through decades of joy and sorrow, all of it real, regardless of the names they used or the secrets they had kept. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Coming here, becoming Robert, living a life built on deception? Alexei considered the question seriously, as he did all things. I regret the pain I caused you and our children when the truth emerged. I regret serving a system I eventually recognized as flawed, but regret our life together? Never. It was the truest thing I've ever known. Below them, on the rocky shore, their grandchildren squealed with delight as James showed them tide pools teeming with life, just as his father had once shown schoolchildren, including a young teacher named Catherine who would change everything. Some of the townspeople glanced their way, still curious about the couple whose seemingly perfect marriage had hidden such extraordinary secrets. But what they couldn't see, what no one could fully understand except the 2 people standing at the point, was how deception had ultimately led to truth, how a mission of division had created unbreakable bonds, how love had transformed a Soviet agent into a husband, father, and grandfather who would choose his family over ideology every time. We should join the others, Catherine said as the sky deepened to purple. Emily brought cake. Alexei nodded but held her hand a moment longer. Catherine, he said softly, thank you for seeing me, the real me, even when I was hiding from myself. She squeezed his hand and led him back toward their family, toward the future they continued to build together, a future founded not on perfect truth or perfect understanding, but on the much more human reality of forgiveness, resilience, and love that perseveres even when everything else falls away. As twilight settled over the Maine coast that September evening in 2026, Catherine and Alexei rejoined their family. The lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, casting momentary illumination before returning to darkness, much like truth itself, appearing in flashes that briefly illuminate our lives before we return to the necessary mysteries of human connection. Their story had no perfect ending, no moment when the pain of deception completely vanished. Instead, they found something perhaps more valuable, the understanding that even lives built on secrets can contain genuine love, and that 45 years of shared history cannot be erased by revelations, no matter how shocking. What would you have done in Catherine's position? Would you have found the strength to rebuild a relationship from such shattered foundations? Or would you have chosen a completely new beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help others facing their own relationship crossroads.